Hello. This is basically a video where I show off all my CSS, all my HTML, all my JavaScript, any coding that I did. This is where I show it. Of course, it will also be included in the presentation, some of the main features, but I felt like maybe I couldn't include everything, or I couldn't talk about it in as much detail as I would like to, keeping in mind the constraints of the presentation. I also have the full video showing off the website navigation in case you're interested as well. I will link that at the end and throughout the video maybe as well, but just in case, I also do have the websites here so you can see which ones I'm referring to. But please do go watch the other videos to see sort of what the coding, what does it actually translate to, what does it actually make. So anyway, let's get started. So the first website I will be talking about is the one which I followed the plan to make. So I believe we should be recording now. Yes. So this one's the one I'm referring to, the code, right? This is the one that, again, the one that I followed the plan to make, right? We already went through this in the other video, but just so you know which one we're referring to, right? So anyway, let's start off. One of the key things to keep in mind, and this is the first thing that I'll talk about, is the actual order, I guess, or the sort of how I've decided to structure my code, because what was recommended for us and what a lot of people did was link an external CSS file and potentially a JavaScript file as well if necessary to the original HTML, right? So you'd have one document for CSS, one document for HTML, and if necessary, one document for JavaScript, right? How do you do that? Well, over here, inside of the head, it doesn't really matter where. This is the head bracket. You can't see where it ends. I'll show that in a second, but anywhere here, for example, in between these lines of code would be fine, right? It's something quite similar to this. I'll explain what it means in a second, but it would be something like link, and that's where you would link your CSS, your JavaScript, right? And then you have another file, and that's where you do all of that. However, I decided not to do that. The reason being, for me, it just didn't work. It wasn't really a visual thing. It was just more of like an actual physical, like the product wasn't as good, right? For some reason, this might have been my fault. I'm not saying it just doesn't work or it's the computer's fault or the program's fault. But for some reason, when I did it, it didn't work as intended. Some of the elements would just look different, and like it didn't give me the product that I wanted. Whereas as soon as I copy and pasted that same line of CSS into my HTML file directly, it worked exactly as I intended it to. So I don't know why I did that. It's something weird. Again, it might be my fault, it might not be, but the way that I found worked for me was just to include my CSS and my JavaScript directly into my HTML, right? So I only have one file for all my code, and obviously as well, the good thing about linking an external CSS file, if you're only gonna have one page, then it's okay. It doesn't really matter what you do. But if you are going to have multiple websites, or multiple pages rather, and you want them to have the same style, that's where linking the CSS is really important, because it's just one line of code and then everything refers back to that CSS file. But then again, there's some things, for example, you have multiple pages and some of the divs, which we'll get to in a second, the classes, you name them similar things, they're always going to refer to the same thing. Whereas if you have the CSS in its own HTML file, then you can name it whatever, and only refers to the CSS in that file. I don't know if I'm explaining myself quite well on that, but it's basically the way it works for me. So anyway, I'll show how that's done. Real quick, I just want to get back to this. This is basically just the little icon that you see here at the top, right? It's just code, really simple, literally one line of code, and it links to a PNG, which I had previously made. Really simple, but I mean, it looks great. I mean, if you go into any website, like for example, Apple here, they're gonna have the little logo up there as well, right? Any website has it, right? You go to Manage Back here, Manage Back, boom, you see they have the little logo there. It's a must to have that logo, in my opinion. In some of the other websites I made, I didn't include the logo because I thought it wasn't so necessary, it wasn't so professional. It was just, these other websites were sort of just to like test all these different like ideas and styles and possibilities. But for the final two websites, I did include the little logo. I forgot what it's called. I don't know what it was called. It had a specific name, but I can't quite remember it right now. These other lines that you see right here, these are just general lines of code that come with a HTML file. Here's where you put the title, so code education, that's what appears on the top. If I also go to here, for example, let's say the iPhone 1. I named it iPhone Showcase inside the title. So that's why here, you come here, iPhone Showcase, that's the name that it's given. Really simple. Again, that comes with the HTML. Here, this little line of code here, it doesn't do much, but if you do want to include multiple languages in your website, then this is where you say, okay, the website that you're currently on is in English. If you also want to translate, I know Google as well translates some websites for you as well automatically. So this is where Google or other websites maybe, or other browsers would be like, okay, what language is this in? English. Okay, now we understand all the text. Now we can simply translate it, right? This is the entrance to the HTML file. This is what it says. Here's where HTML starts. We can go all the way to the bottom. Is the end HTML tag, right? That's where the HTML ends. So, with that out of the way, how do I include the CSS and the JavaScript into my HTML file, into one file? It's quite simple. Basically, what you need to do is you need to add this style function. And it doesn't really matter where you add it as long as it's in the head, right? So here, you can see that's where the head begins. You can scroll down. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this perfectly. I have to guess where it is. It is a bit far down. I do have quite a lot. There you go. Head. You can put the styling function anywhere inside of these head brackets, right? And so you can see as well the styling function also has a start. This is the end. And it also has the starts, which we see here. So anything in between the style here, I'm not going to scroll all the way back to the bottom, but anything inside of the style brackets, the code, when the browser is reading through the code, it's going to recognize all of that as CSS, right? Anything outside of that would obviously be, actually, I'll get to that in a second because anything outside of that isn't necessarily HTML. But anyway, inside of the style is where we included all the CSS. We can scroll down past the style. Here we go. Into the body. So this is where the HTML actually comes in, right? So anything inside of the body, again, this is just very basic with all HTML files. Anything inside the body will be seen as HTML, right? So for example, this is HTML, this is HTML, let's say this is HTML. This, however, is no longer inside of the body bracket, so it no longer is read as HTML. If we scroll down to the bottom again, this is where the body ends. So anything outside of the body, if I was to write haha here, and I was to reload my other document, you wouldn't be able to see it. Whereas as soon as it's inside the body, it doesn't really matter where, it's just a show, haha. For example, I reload this web page, I'm pretty sure this is it. There you go. You can see haha there at the bottom, right? Because it's in the body, right? Anything outside though, again, would not be visible. So that's the HTML. However, there's an exception to the HTML. If you want to add JavaScript, you need to use, similar to the CSS, you need to use the script function. So slightly different, but it's sort of the same function basically, where anything inside of these brackets here is read as JavaScript, right? So you can see this, if I was to put this outside of the script function, it would make absolutely no sense because HTML doesn't know how to process this, right? If that makes sense. So anyway, that's kind of the layout of my code. I just want to talk about that real quick before we actually get into the specifics. So I think we'll start with the HTML because I think that's the easiest as well. And obviously, as we're going through the HTML, we can always refer back to CSS. So again, some of these websites are styled quite similarly, but we'll go kind of quick because obviously there's a bunch of code here. You could be here for days if I really want to, but anyway. The main way that this has been made is obviously using the div function, right? So basically, I'm not entirely sure what it stands for. I assume it stands for division. Anyway, that's besides the point. What's important is that typically what you'll do is inside the div function, you'll include what's called a class. Now, what is a class? Basically, a class is just a name that you give to certain elements. So anything inside of this div function, let me find a clear div function here where you can see it starts and then end. Let's say this, right? Navbar, boom. Anything inside of this beginning div, say bracket, and this final one, that is all given the class of navbar. It's kind of given the identity. Well, sorry, identity was technically ID, but for the simplicity of the explanation, it would be given the identity of navbar. So what does that mean? It means that anything inside of that div is now referred back to the CSS here, navbar, right? So basically what that means is typically the whole HTML file will follow these more general CSS functions, right? So for example, body is generally always, unless told to not do so, is always going to have this font, it's always going to have this margin, the HTML document is always going to have this scroll behavior. However, if you come here to I'll show a quick trick as well, because this is going to save a lot of time. If you press Command Shift R, you can then search for the specific function here so much faster. Boom, there you go. We're already at the nav bar. Okay, so that's just a little trick, which we'll be using as well. So don't think I'm just magically skimming through a document. But anyway, anything inside of this nav bar function will be referred back to in the CSS, right? So how do you do that? How do you refer to it? Literally type anything here, add a dot, add the same name that you gave below, add a dot in front of it, the same brackets as you would normally, and again, all of this is just CSS, right? What you want it to do. So I'll get into what this means in a second, but that's sort of how the div function works, right? There might be more complicated explanations, but that's the simple one. That's what I personally know, and it's been working for me, right? So you'll see a bunch of divs throughout the document. I think it's impossible to code any of these websites really without using divs. That's how important it is. And being able to classify certain things with a specific class, that's crucial. So anyway, here we just see a header, right? So for example, I named the header, so we can go up here, header, boom, here we go, header. Where did it go? Here we go, header. So what does it have? It has a bit of padding, which means what's important, and I talked about this. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna use my own website as well to show off what the padding means, because it's quite important. This is a really nice page. I don't think there's a clear. Yeah, this is a really nice page. This is not a really nice page. I thought this was better. Hold on. Padding and margin in CSS. It's so much better if I can explain it visually. Here we go. So basically, how is HTML document seen? Or what are the 4 basic principles, let's say? The first most important thing is the content, right? That's what you actually see, right? So if I was to type hello, that'd be part of the content, for example. Then there's another feature which is called padding, and that's sort of, actually before we get into padding, I'm gonna try to do this in order, right? Border. The next most important thing, let's say, is border, right? So it's literally the thing that goes around the content. So my content is this, for example. The border would be anything that goes around it, the thing that wraps around it, right? Really simple. It's like if you draw a square, anything inside of the lines of the square would be the content, and the lines themselves would be the border. Now, next, the padding is the space that you have in between the border and the content, right? So for example, what can I use here to example? Here we go. Let's just use this case, right? Imagine this, the outside is the border, anything inside is the content. Now, if you don't add any padding and you don't center the text, right? If the text is, by default, the text and the content is always going to be on the top left. I don't know if you're seeing that as top left, but I am at least. Everything is always by default going to be on the top left, right? So if you don't add any padding, the text is going to appear literally right here by the edge, pretty much touching the border. What you can do though with padding is that, for example, if I had 10 pixels of padding, sorry, what it means is that the text is still going to come from the top left, but it's going to be 10 pixels away from the top and the left of the border. So that's sort of how padding works. Again, these are super important things to understand. And margin, again, going back to the same example, I guess, is anything outside of the border. So for example, if I had two different elements here, right? The margin, what it does, if there's no margin, it basically just, these two things would be stuck together, right? As soon as I add a little bit of margin, it means that there's space outside of the border. So it's spread these out, right? Because margin, basically what it is all the space outside of it, right? So it's similar to padding, but instead of being inside of the border, it's outside. But that's, again, these are super important. And once you understand that, you can really start to play around with the CSS and how it works. I thought I had a photo in my HTML document. I just had this for some reason. I guess I could have used this as well to explain it, but either way, let's go back to the HTML. The other thing I have is a background, which I linked with a URL. You can link an actual URL to an actual image you found online, or here, which we'll see later as well, you can just literally just put the name of a photo that you have saved to your laptop. Now, the thing about saving photos to your laptop is it has to be saved to the same file that your CSS, or sorry, your HTML is saved to, right? So you can't just save your images anywhere. You can't just save them in download and that'll be it. They have to be in a specific folder, and that folder needs to be the same folder that everything is in, right? So I'm just gonna go to my folder real quick to show this. Documents, here we go, coding, right? I have a folder for coding, forget everything outside. Folder for coding, you can open it up, and this is where I have all the images that I've used basically throughout this coding unit, right? And you can also see the HTML here as well. Typically I'll be using as well JPEG as the main image formats, but you can also use PNG, right? Whatever you want. Here we also see background size. There's multiple ways of doing this, but basically there's multiple ways to count, I guess, the width and the height and the distance, let's say, right? So like in real life, you have, for example, centimeters, meters, but then you also have, like, for example, yards, inches, right, etc., etc. So it's the same thing in HTML. We'll go through a couple of them in a second. But background size, you can also use percentage. Background size, what it refers to is this, right? Now, the other important height that's important to know as well is the actual height of the section, right? So the background size and the height of the section is not the same, right? What this means is that this section here, the header, is going to be 742 pixels in height, right? That's really important as well. You can also use something which we'll use in a second as well. It's just called HV? No, VH, sorry. VH, vertical height is what it stands for, I believe, right? So we'll also get into that in a second. It works very similarly to percentage. But anyway, what it's saying is that this header section is going to be 742 pixels in height, and the background, right, is going to cover up 100% of that. So here, instead of 100, I could, if I really wanted to, just use the command cover, and it would do the same thing, right? But I typically use percentage. I just like it, I guess. Now, these 4 lines of code here, what's important to know about these is that for some of my websites, you'll see here, if I come back to this one, you can see the background here in the header. The header is this, by the way, just for reference, is literally this, up until the nav bar here at the bottom. Everything above that is the header. So what's important to know is that these 4 lines of code, what they do is the background here, the image of the desert, it stays still, as you can see, right? Now, this is called parallax. A lot of modern websites use it nowadays. It's really cool. But what this is saying is that this background is going to stay still, right? So the elements around it aren't going to impact it. It isn't going to move upwards, etc., right? I mean, I could go into what these means, but you don't really need to know what it means. You just need to know that these 4 together mean that it stays still. But again, background attachment, fixed. It's fixed. Background position, it's centered. Again, these are basic things as well. Background repeat doesn't repeat. Background size, it covers. This is the same as this as well, essentially. But yeah, actually, I don't know why I have it there twice, to be honest. That's a good point. But either way, regardless. So as, for example, the header, right? I do quickly want to come back into here and show off what this means. These are general. Again, the body, the fonts, Arial. What this means is that this is the font that's going to be used all along. Margin 0. This is really important because if I was to take that away, you can see that now there's a weird gap in my document, right, around it, all the way around it. Basically, what you're saying is that you want no margin, you want no space in between all of your elements and the side of the page in your document, right? So again, this goes back to what we were talking about before. Really important in almost all websites, I think. And this last line of code is really important as well. You can add it once and it works great because we'll show how this works in a second as well with HTML. But what it does, if I was to click this button, instead of just, if I was to, again, I'll just remove it here so you can see how it would look like. If I was to remove that line of code, if I was to click one of these buttons, it would just literally transport me to the section that it's linked to, right? Right? Whereas if I now add this button again, what it does is when I click on one of these buttons, instead of just like transporting me there directly, what it does is it scrolls down for you, right? Don't really know how to explain it. It's just how it works, I guess. But that's a really cool feature, and it makes it look really, really cool, right? So you can really play around with this, and it's honestly so much fun as well. Yeah. So that's really important as well. These are sort of general. The other thing that you notice as well is these little gray lines. So what does this mean? What this means, it actually doesn't mean anything. It's just a comment. There's no easier way of putting it, right? So you'll see as well, I did something similar in my HTML. Let me find an example here. For example, JavaScript. To add a comment, basically what it means is that anything inside, it's different for HTML and CSS, but anything for HTML, to add a comment, you need these things here and these here. So it's literally just 2 lines and one of the brackets open and an exclamation point at the beginning for the first one. And anything you write inside of these, so all of this is seen as a comment. So it basically doesn't impact your HTML, your CSS, right? It's just for you or for whoever is reading this, right? So I like to use them a lot to separate the sections, right? And it's just mostly a way, like if I'm scrolling through this fast, like I see, boom, JavaScript, like right there, because it's like a little bumper between the things, right? So you'll see as well in my HTML, I have a couple of lines of space here. I don't actually need spacing, but for me, visually, it helps me like differentiate where something starts and where something ends, which is really important sometimes because it can really mess you up if you're just looking, each. Can't find the start and the end of something, right? So that's how you add a comment in HTML, and that's how you add a comment in CSS. Again, you don't need it, but for you as well, if you're coding, it helps so much. So all my CSS has been organized in specific sections, as you can see. The next thing I'm going to get to is when you do something like this, right? We have dot header, same as here, okay. But then H1, now, what is H1? H1 basically stands for header 1. You can have anything in between H1 and H6. They're all different types of headers with different sizes, right? So H1 is the largest header that you can have, whereas H6 is the smallest one. Now, by doing this, what it means, it reads it from left to right like we would, right? So it says, anything inside of header that is also H1 will have this specific elements, right? So, for example, H1 header. Here, header. This paragraph, since this is a paragraph, it is not impacted by what we just saw above. However, it's inside of the header, this line here, it's inside of the header class, and it's also an H1. So what does that mean? It means that it's linked all the way back to this top part here because it's inside the header and it's an H1, which means it has this specific value added to it, right? So that's something really important as well. You'll see as well being used. You'll see it being used so much. It's really important. So you can play around as well here. You can put P for paragraph, B for body. You could put really whatever you want. There's no limits to what you can do. You can literally also add, you could add another class here as well. Okay, dot header wouldn't make sense, but dot header, and let's say we had another class there, right? For example, because one of the things that you can also play around with, I didn't use it too much, but it's also important to know as well in CSS and HTML, there's this thing generally known in the coding community as the parent div and the child div. And basically, so you can have the parent div, which would be dot header, and if I also type here another class, dot whatever, that would be the child div, right? So that's also something nice to know. Anyway, we can skip past the footer. We can skip past the about section. These are just the color in RGB value. No, not RGB. Hex, no, hold on. What is the name of that value? Hopefully I can find it quick. I don't want to waste too much time on it. This value here, RGB. Oh, it is RGB. Okay, sorry. Well, I was mistaken there. Okay. There's a couple different ways you can type in the colors. One is RGB. There's also RGBA, but that's something there. I'm getting really confused, but you'll see it in a second. Oh, here. See, this RGBA This is another color. This is not RGB. I don't know what the name of this is. I'm so sorry. I'm forgetting, but either way. There's different ways of adding colors. These two little functions here, they're both colors, but they're expressed in a different way. But essentially this color here, if I was to search it up online, I could find the same way to code it using this format, I guess. However, the good thing about RGBA, and this you'll see as well, is that you have the 3 values. This is RGB. And now this last part here, the A part, what it sort of stands for is the opacity, right? So here it's 0.4, so it has an opacity of 40%, right? These 3 numbers here, 0, 0, 0. Again, if I was to write it here as well, 0, 0, 0, that would be the color for black, right? So it says black, this is gonna be the color black, and it's gonna have 40% opacity, right? And the box shadow option here as well, really cool. Basically adds a little shadow, I don't know if you can see it there, but adds a little shadow behind the elements that you decide to add it for, right? So we'll continue moving down until we find something interesting, I guess. Again, background size cover, we'll see it here as well. The percentages can change as well, background size there. Continue moving on here, you can see the URL. This isn't an external, this is not like an online file. This is something which I have saved to my folder. I don't know why this says PO. That shouldn't be there, but oh, whatever. I'll just leave it just in case it's necessary, but it shouldn't do anything. So anyway, again, padding, we'll see padding and margin is super important. Again, I cannot stress that enough. So we'll move on into the navbar section, I guess. Overflow hidden, what this means is that if you have, again, going to the parent and div section, I don't want to spend too long on this, but if the div is bigger than the parent, basically any of the child div that is shown outside, that appears outside of the parent div will be hidden, right? Really simple. Again, background color is the same style. Now, this is quite important as well, and it's used a lot for navigation bars, especially if you want them to start at the bottom and then end at the top, whatever. Position sticky. Now, what that means is, as you can see here, as I'm scrolling down, this is the nav bar here. The nav bar sticks to the top of the page. And to do that, you need these 2 commands, position sticky and position WebKit sticky. So one of the things that you'll see as well in coding is this WebKit command. You kind of need it, right? Without that, it wouldn't stick. And then this last value here, top 0, represents where you want it to stick, right? So top 0 would literally be 0 pixels away from the top, which is what you see here, right? So if I was to, for example, 100, change that to 100, scroll down. Sorry, have I done something wrong? Yes, I have done something wrong. I didn't include the pixels. That's important as well. You do sometimes need to include the measurements. It isn't always necessary, but do always include it just in case. Here you can see the nav bar now sticks 100 pixels away from the top of the page, right? So anyway, that's just a nice way of seeing that. 0 is fine as well. You don't need, typically you don't need measurements for 0. And then here, z-index is really important. We all know about the x and the y-axis. There's another axis called the z-axis, right? So that's basically x, y. The z-axis is how close or far away the elements is away from the screen. Now, by default, all elements will have z-index of 0. So by adding z-index of 1, it means that it's, let's say this x, y-axis, it means it's, let's say, 1 position across the axis closer to you. So if I was to make this -1, this is the nav bar we're talking about. Let's go back to the top. What this means is that this would now appear behind the other elements. We don't want that, right? We want it to appear always in front, right? You see there, it doesn't follow us. As soon as I get rid of the minus, it is now in front of everything, because by default, everything has z-index of 0. So if I was to make this, if I was to have this have an index of, a z-index of, say, 2, it would appear in front of the navigation bar. If I was to make this 0, the reason why you need this for navigation bar sometimes, because if I was to make this 0, you can see it does well with some things, but there's other things that just go on top of it, right? The background is generally fine, the other elements, not so fine. So, z-index of 1, really important for navigation bar. Yeah, just makes it look so much better. So we'll continue moving down. Flows is just basically saying that you want it to sort of be on that side, right? Especially if you're playing with the idea of flex, for example. You want floats, it means that the elements are going to be on that side, on the left side, or floating on the left side, right? Position on the left. Float right means they're positioned on the right. Padding here, what this means is that you have 14 pixel padding across the x-axis, 20 across the y-axis, right? So you could have one value for the padding. That would mean padding across on all axes. You can have two values, which would mean the first number is the padding to the left and to the right of the element. The second value upwards and below the elements, right? You can also have four, where you would literally control each side of the padding, I guess, separately, right? The one thing I forgot to mention, color. There's a really important thing, and this did mess me up sometimes, is that background color and color are not to be mistaken. Color always refers to the element, whereas background color refers to the background, right? So if I also change the background color, that wouldn't change the color of the text. If I also change the value for this color command here to black, it wouldn't affect the background, it would just affect the text. So that's important. It seems obvious, but that did mess me up sometimes. Text align center, obvious. The text is always going to be centered, as well as images. So we can continue moving down. Transition, we'll see this. This isn't the best representation, but we'll see it in a second, sort of how that works, right? Yeah. What this means here as well is playing around with the idea of parent div and like smaller. So anything inside of the nav bar that is A stands for link, and is active, is going to have these commands, right? This is a bit more complicated again here. Anything that's inside the nav bar that is a link, but is hovering, which we'll see in a second as well, this colon hover. Anything that's any links that you're hovering over inside of the navigation bar, follow these commands. Again, it's sort of confusing, but once you get it, you understand. Again, there's the same idea here as well with the rows. You have, instead of WebKit, you have MS, Flexbox, and Display Flex, which means kind of everything can sort of go all over the place. That's a whole other word, though, another world, though. I don't want to get into that because, you know, there's entire tutorials on that online, so I don't want to get too into that. But either way, again, this whole row content here is slightly harder. It takes a bit more time to talk about. But this would be for you know, any tables that you might have. This center is just for anything that I want to center. I don't know why I use that. I shouldn't have needed it, but either way, maybe for one part I needed it. This side and main are the commands that you see here at the beginning. This grayish part here is the side. This is the main. And you can see here the MS Flex has 70% of the screen, right? 30% of the screen, right? Continue moving down. These two commands are interesting. The media screen and max width, what it means, and we'll see this better later, but it means that any devices that are less than 700 pixels wide follow these specific commands for whatever div you've given it, right? And again, for this, any devices that are less than 400 pixels wide follow these specific commands for the specific div that you've told it to do so. So any other divs, regardless of how big or small the screen size is, will follow the general divs that you've given it. However, this specific div is different for the max width, right? See why that might be important later on, but you can do some really cool things with that. We continue moving on until we see something, I guess, worth mentioning. Again, these are just the background. We'll skip past the cards because these are all the same, but slightly different. Zoom, this is quite nice. Anything that I've given the value of zoom, this isn't the most practical way of doing it, but either way, that's how I did it originally. Anything that you've given this value of zoom means that, this is a class, but what it means is that when you hover over anything that is labeled under the zoom parent div, under a zoom class, let's say, what it means is that it's going to transform, it's going to scale upwards by 1.015. It's a really small number, but a lot of the time, especially with bigger objects, if you make this even 1.1, that might not sound like that big of a difference, but trust me, it is. So this is something quite subtle. And the idea of transition, again, we'll see this better later, but it basically means it's going to take 0.5 seconds for it to do this command. And this is quite important as well. Here, it says that for it to go back to the original, it's also going to take 0.5 seconds, right? And continue moving down. This is the whole idea of parallax. This was sort of how I first began to understand it. This is I don't think it's actually in the HTML, but this is like when I first started understanding parallax, is how I played around with it. These are like the basic principles of parallax. You need the image, the background. You need to set some dimensions to it, and again, these are the main things for the parallax. This is really important. I do want to get back to it in a second. And this, what we're playing around with the nth child. This is important as well. This is again just a class. Nth child, what it means is that sometimes you're gonna have classes, but you're gonna have multiple elements in that same class. What it means, nth child is, for example, seventh child. Again, playing around with the idea of the parent div and the child div, right? So for example, second nth, okay, nth doesn't rhyme with, it doesn't go with two. But for the second nth child, the second child in that list, it would follow this specific command. The third child in that list would follow this specific command. So for this, we'll see what this does later, but it means, for example, if it's coming up from upwards, for example, an animation where the objects go upwards, the first child would just go up as soon as it can. The second would have a transition delay of 0.8 seconds or 800 milliseconds, and the third would have a delay of 1,600 milliseconds, right? So it's kind of here like boom, 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 right? So yeah, that's sort of the nth child. We can continue going down, 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 down. This slightly more complex. It's for here at the end, at the subject here. So it's kind of saying, well, it's kind of the dimensions, I guess. But basically what this is saying is that you can type, this is where you would type, right? This is the specific function you give to something for you to be able to type in it, right? Here I can type, whereas, for example, in this image, I can't type, right? So that's sort of what this does, and this sets the dimensions and the colors and everything like that. You can continue going down, down, down. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention for colors is here, for example, you can see I have color orange. This would be the same thing if I was to go find the color orange and add it with the hashtag here and the number value, whatever. But you can also just like write the color of, sorry, the name of the color. So for example, white, there's many different whites. There's white smoke, ghost white, floral white, Navajo white, and antique white, right? So all those are types of whites that the program can understand, and you can also use if you want to. Let me not change the Z index on that, and now I've completely lost my place. Let me come back. Okay, well this is where we are at. This is slightly more complicated. The dot, again, this is a class, and now this idea of after means you have an element here. You have an element here. And then there's always, for each element, if you add it, you have the before and the after, right? So the after in this case is everything that goes underneath it, right? If I was to do this and change this for before, you can have both before and after, but if I was to have before, this would be referring to everything on top of that. What it means is that, again, let me not change the Z index. Now I must go all the way back down. Here we go. Means that this is referring to anything underneath that specific div or the childhood elements, right? Content is something that you always need here. You can, if you type anything here, this is what you would see underneath that, underneath that element. But if you don't want anything to appear, just add the 2 apostrophes and nothing. But this is necessary. Even if you don't want any text, you need to have that. It's super important. Anyway, this took a while, but this is referring to this here. These are ratings, right? It's sort of a 3 column layout. Basically, I'll sort of summarize what it means. But this is essentially a 3 column layout. This is column 1, column 2, and column 3 at the end. Obviously, column 2 being the widest of all. And for each bar, you can see this is 1 bar, this is 2 bars, this is 3 bar. Bar 5 refers to obviously this bar, which represents the 5 stars, right? So it's saying it's going to have a width of 60% in this case. Height is always going to be the same because we want them all to have the same height. Background color, they can change. That's why they have different background colors. So for example, if I was to make this 000. Also for the hashtags, you can add you can add 6 numbers, but if you add 3, it sort of autofills the last 3 numbers as the same ones that you've just used. But if I had 000, this would now change to black, which is the 000 again, as I said before, the color for black. Here we go. So anyway, that's kind of what it means. Again, bar 5, hover. This playing around with the idea of hovering over the bar, and it changes the scale and the color. And again, you have to add the transition time. Again, the idea of the media max width is saying that any devices that are less than 400 pixels wide follow this specific command for these elements, right? Anyway, that's all for the CSS. Again, I mean, I could get into this, but this, again, a whole other world. But sometimes as well, inside of the, for example, these little brackets here, the P bracket, you can also add things such as the colors. It's like its own separate CSS. You can add things like, for example, the styling, the color. These are commands, for example, bold, and this is what I refer to back as well at the top. This is really important here, ID section. What this means is that for this contact us section, this button here at the top, what it means is that when you click on it, it's gonna take you to the place that has been given the identification of section 4. So where's section 4? If you go down here to contact us, you can see here, div ID section, section 4, which means, but when I click this button, it's gonna take me down to this last section where this is section 4. Section 4, it would start anything here below. Well, the one thing I didn't like, and I didn't exactly know how to fix, I don't want to spend too much time, is the fact that here the nav bar is sort of blocking the footer, the section header, whatever you want to call it, because the top of the nav bar is also going to be at the top of the footer, right? So sort of blocks it a bit. Oh, well, it's not too bad, but anyway, that's how that works. That's how the navigation bar works. If you just add a hashtag, it is just going to refer you to the start of the document. It's like if you open it up brand new. That's that. Again, here you can play around with the style, the height, for example, of images. These are a bunch of divs. There's a bit of a misunderstanding. The first website I didn't code ideally, but oh well, I guess if it works, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is what they say. So yeah, again, a bunch of divs like zoom, which we looked at before. Hidden. Oh yeah, I do need to get back to that in a second. But either way, you can see again here, I added a bit of space to like be able to tell apart the different sections. Not much to say here. Again, these divs are referring back to what we saw above, right? So yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can look at it here real quick. A bunch of hours went into this without a doubt. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just continue going down. This table here, absolute nightmare to code, because each bar and each here, if you go down to the table, this was one thing I had to code. This thing that says 5-star, that's one thing you have to code. The bar is another thing you have to code. This number here is another thing that you have to code. So you have to code so many different elements separately. It was a nightmare, it really was. But I guess eventually you get it done, right? Once you understand the gist of it. These classes are, again, they're a mess. I don't know how I did it. I ended up using things like write you, like under, super confusing. But just because I didn't want to write the full thing. But another thing that you can do as well, if you want to write full words, and you don't just want to write, for example, right, imagine I want to write right under. I can type it like this, right under, but the other thing you can do, write that little dash, and then under, and then this is still seen as one word, which is really sweet, but I didn't do that because I was too lazy to type that little line and the rest of the word. This is sort of the end here again. You can see here as well, for example, select. This is referring to this little part here, where you can select 3 options. That's what it means, select. This is sort of how it works. Select option. Don't know how to explain it. That's how CSS works, right? But there's one command for selecting, and then anything inside the select, if you add the option bracket, let's say, that's one specific option, right? So yeah. And I think that's pretty much it. Again, this text area, what we were referring to before, is how like you can write inside of there, right? And then you can also add placeholders, which is really cool. I don't know why I said it with an accent. It's really cool. Basically means sort of like the text that you can see before you write, right? So your last name, that's the placeholder, your last name. And that's pretty much it. The last thing I want to talk about is the JavaScript. This is really important. But basically, this JavaScript is what makes it the animations here. I'll go to this document now for a bit because the other one is sort of annoying me. I don't really like the way it looks. But anyway, you see this animation here where I scroll down, boom, it's like goes upwards. This is done with this, right? So basically, I'll go back to CSS. I guess this would be the easiest way to do it. Again, I'll just use Command R, hidden. Where did it go? Okay, that just absolutely didn't work. That didn't work. I got scammed. Hidden. Here we go. Okay, again, where did it go? Here. Okay. I'm sorry. This is not very professional what I'm doing, but either way, hidden and show. These are the two classes that you need for the whole animation. What it means is that whenever something is in the hidden class, it's obviously going to have an opacity of 0 so that you can't see it. Transition is how long it's going to take for it to go back into the hidden, or for it to go into the hidden state. Filter, this is something that sort of like whilst it's coming in or coming out, that's sort of like the blur it's going to have, right? So, for example, if you see a car, this is just for aesthetic purposes, but if you see a car, for example, just to understand it, going down the street really fast, you're not going to be able to see it perfectly. If you were to take a photo, look at the photo on your phone, it would likely be very blurry. So that's sort of why I've done the blur. It just looks more natural. And then transform X here, I could also do transform Y. It would do the same thing, but basically, translate X. Transform is the outside here, div command. Translate X here. I could also change X for Y, and basically that means instead of it moving across the X-axis, it would just move across the Y-axis. Yeah, really simple. What this means is that whenever something is hidden, it needs to go 100%, it needs to move negative 100% on the X-axis. Basically moving it outwards, I guess, out of frame. Yeah, and now for that to work, we need elements to be able to switch. So you'll see here, for example, in the HTML, everything is given the class hidden. You don't see the class show. So how do you switch an element from hidden to show? Well, you use a bit of JavaScript. This is the only JavaScript I really use, but either way. What this means, I haven't done a masterclass on Java, but I do sort of understand the basic principles of this. What it says is that it's constantly going to observe any elements that enter the view, right? Again, this is quite complicated. But it's gonna observe anything that's inside the view. So what it's saying is, if it is intersecting in the view, you're gonna add it to that class of show. We're gonna move straight downwards to this last line. If the elements are outside of the view, it is gonna go back to the class of hidden. Anything that isn't in the view is in the class hidden. Again, it's probably the most complicated thing I've done, but basically what it says is you're going to look for all the elements in the page that are given a specific class of hidden, right? So basically what this means is that you're going to want to look for the hidden, everything that's in hidden. If it's given the hidden elements, it's going to constantly be looking at if it's in the frame. If it is in the frame, add it to the class of show. What this does is that if it isn't in the frame, it sort of removes it from the class of show, so it goes back. So you can have animations multiple times, right? There you can see, boom, boom. If I was to remove this line, now add this, you have the animation once, that's it. Because it doesn't go back to the class of hidden. That's kind of that. So this looks so much better. I think, in my opinion, if you can have animations multiple times, you can also add it so that certain people can choose to turn it off, so they don't have to look at your animations so many times. But I want everybody to look at our animations all the time. Yes, you're looking at it regardless. So these are the same principles that made the WebDark website, the darker version, right? It's just the styling is generally different. And we'll move on to the Air Jordan 4s. The main thing here is if I can find it. But basically, one of the things that you'll notice in the Jordan 4s is that it snaps to a specific section, right? So to do that, first of all, what I need to do is find where the line of code is. If I can find it, I'm sorry. I should probably have this ready. If I can find it. I cannot find it. I'm really struggling. Hold on, give me a second. What am I doing wrong? Text, no. Padding, no. Ah, here we go. It took me a while, but we got it. Section. What I played around in this document is the use of sections. So instead of divs, sometimes what you see is this section. What it means is that, well, it's just essentially a div, right? But it's sort of named differently, I guess. But section here, to do this animation of it sticking to specific sections, you need to have 2 lines of code, but I wanted 2 different variants, right? Because what you'll notice here, this sticks to the top of the page. So the thing that it's looking for here, the blue, literally the top of the blue, that's what it's looking to stick to, right? Whereas, for example, this here, if it stuck to the top, it would look like this. That would look weird in my opinion. So I wanted it to stick to the middle. So that's why I have 2 variants. But what it means is that it's gonna have the snap start align. The snap align to start. It's gonna snap at the start. You also need to mention the heights of the sections. And inside the containers, you want to snap it to the Y proximity, the Y axis, rather than the X, but that would be, you literally need a whole completely different website for that. Or for the Y, again, this is the same thing. You're looking for it across the Y axis. I mean, these are lines of code. It's mostly, this is a scroll snap align. Start, you can also add it to center, which is what I did for this one here, for it to snap to the center, but everything else snap the snap align to the top. So yeah. Then this iPhone here, this is playing a lot with the before and the hovers, but it's the same idea of like before and after here, and you play around a lot with the opacity as well and the movement of certain objects, right? And so I made 2 versions of this. You have obviously the simple, and then you have the complicated one. It's the same code, but it's slightly more complicated, right, for some of them. But yeah, again, if I was to talk about this, this would be like a whole different thing. So I don't want to waste too much time on that. We can go to landing dark. This one is simple and cool. Basically what you're playing around with here, this isn't the best way to like show it. Hold on, glass. Can I find an image? Container, CSS. Can I find a cool way? Glass morphism. Here, for example, okay. Basically what it kind of does, this container here, the background is blurred inside of it, right? And basically the way you do this is, the background, you want to have a linear gradient, and again, you play with the RGBA. So right to bottom means that it's going to go towards the right to bottom. So it's going to start at the top left and work its way to the right to bottom. So this first value is the value of the color at the top left, and this value here is the value, the color, when it reaches the bottom of the right bottom, right? So anything in between is calculated obviously by the machine, unless you can add more values here and add the percentage of when you want it to be at that value. It's a bit more complicated. It doesn't do, I mean, it doesn't complicate it too much, but that is something else you can do if you want to. Yeah, border rate is just making it, I guess, rounded. But basically, it's playing with the RGBA where you play around with the opacity, and that allows you to see behind it, right? And then you also play around with the blur, 2 rem. Oh, I didn't show off the VH. Oh, here it is, VH. VH, what it means is that it's going to take up 100% of the vertical heights available. So if I was to make this 120 VH, what it would mean is that the document would now be 100% of the vertical height plus another 20%. However, that's not what we want, because we don't want to be able to scroll here. So it's just 100, right? You can't scroll anymore, right? So there you go. Another thing is rem. I believe a rem is equal to 16 pixels, right? So it's the same thing as pixels, just a unit of measurements, right? 1 rem, 16 pixels, same thing, right? So here if I was to add, 2 rem, 16, that'd be 32 pixels. If I was to add 32 pixels, it would be the same. I'm not gonna do it because it's gonna be hard. Again, this isn't the best way to show off the idea of the glass morphism, but I guess it does the job. I guess something simple. It's not the website that I'm most proud of, but hey, it works. It does the job. Again, this idea of the parent div and then anything that's inside of this that it has this value, that is an image, gonna have these elements. Again, same thing. We can move on to scroll animation. This is where I learned the whole scroll animation. Again, this refers to the nth child, where a specific child will have delay depending on what order on the list it is. This is quite similar to what we've shown before. Again, this JavaScript you're going to see in a lot of my documents because it is the same throughout. Split parallax, what this is, this one's a little bit more interesting. What it means is that here you can see on the left, it sticks, right? So again, I show this off in my website navigation video, but what it means here is sticks to the left. How do you do that? You do need a bit of JavaScript for that. And what you want is you're gonna want to source outside like an external file, right? And these external files can have like specific function, right? So it's the same thing if here at the beginning I was to link an external file for a link, right? A link that isn't defaulted, like it isn't a default link in HTML or CSS, so you need to link it to an external file, which does have it, and that way it can write it. But anyway, this is sort of, again, this is more complicated. This could be a whole other video, but basically here what you can see is that you have you have three different things. Okay, you have the trigger, you have the start, and you also have the end. So what does it mean? It means that this animation here where this sticks is going to be triggered when this trigger 1 reaches the start to 0. That's when it clicks. Before that, it doesn't click, and it doesn't stop clicking, it doesn't stop staying there until it reaches this end 1 line. So you can see as soon as it reaches there, boom, it's done. It's done. It moves on, right? So that's kind of what that is. That's kind of what the JavaScript is for. Yeah, and this is all really easy, really simple. We can move on to transition because this does have the idea of keyframes, which is really cool. And it allows you to have an effect like this. Boom, right? Where you have an animation at the start. So how do you do that? Well, I'll show you, I guess. Where can I do this? Here, keyframes. Here, what it's saying is a keyframe is 0, so when it hasn't started, you want it to have this value. What's done, it needs to have this value. Again, this could be its own video, but keyframes is nice because you can play around with like the idea of when it starts, when it ends. You can have it do something at specific times, yeah, and then these other things all playing around with the idea of these elements sort of coming in. For example, translate Y 100 pixels. I assume it's referring to the button, which scrolls. Well, I guess all of these scroll up. Okay, but it could be referring to any of these, if not all of them. Well, I guess each one would be this. Okay, but yeah, it plays around with the idea of it scrolling up. But that's the main thing here, the keyframes, right? Playing around with the idea of time, right? What will the value be at a specific time? And the other thing here, var contrast. This basically is linked somewhere else where, I don't know why I'm looking at the HTML. Contrast color. Let me find it here, root. Basically what it's saying here is that you can have contrast color and it'll have a specific value that way. You don't have to write what the contrast color is all the time. You don't have to write this number here all the time. Now, why is this important? Not because you might be too lazy to just copy and paste this number a couple of different times, but if you do want to change it here, contrast color, for example, let's just make it white for it to be really noticeable. No hashtag white, just white. Now, what it does is going to change all of these colors, all these background colors, or just general colors that are under this contrast color command, or like under the title. So it's kind of the same thing as a div. See, there is white because I changed the contrast color. If I change this back to the original one, it is now no longer white. It's kind of a specific value that's been given before, and you can always refer back to this here, and then this can be like a central way of just referring back to that. So anyway, I think that's going to be it. I have talked for a while. We're closing in on the hour mark. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know why I've sat here and talked for an hour. But either way, that's pretty much it. I just want to show off the CSS here real quick. So you can really see in the HTML and the coding, and you can see like, you know, how these websites been made. And I want to show off the fact that I do understand what I've made. You know, I'm like, this isn't copy and paste. This is a lot of weeks of time that has been implemented, and it's been a learning process. And all these different websites, you know, have allowed me to you know, make my final product. Honestly, here now if I was to make a new website, and I know how it works, and I feel like everything could be a lot neater. The one thing I regret here, for example, in the like new web, this one, right, is that this was the second website I ever made. So a lot of features, again, I talked about this in the other video, but a lot of the features were they were really basic, and as I was learning, I kept on adding on to this main website, which is why here, for example, you see a bunch of unnecessary divs. You don't need this many divs. But I added it because these are things I added gradually, right, as I was working, as I was learning new things. I thought, oh, look, I just learned this one thing that's really cool. Let me add it back to this website. And that's why there's so many divs. It's a mess. You know, again, it works, but if I did want to make changes, it wouldn't be as easy to make a change in this website as it would be to make a change in this website. But then again, yeah. Again, you can also see the idea of like comments here just to separate the different sections, right, and all that. So yeah, I think that's going to be pretty much it. Watch the other video as well. I definitely do recommend it just to see the actual navigation of the websites, and I'll talk about a lot of the features that it has and what these features actually do, right? So I think that's really cool, really interesting. Again, I will be talking about, I'll be writing up what these animations, what this code does in the presentation. But this is just a video format, a way of communicating that and showing it. But again, check everything out, I guess. And yeah, that's gonna be pretty much it. Thank you very much.